Friday, everyone. I'm Sonam, back with a new episode of AI Chronicles. Every day or every other day, we see a new generative AI tool like new LLMs, vector databases, orchestration frameworks, and so on and so on. It's really hard to keep up, in my opinion. That's why I invited one of my favorite developer advocates, Yujian from Zillis, to talk about not only the open source AI tools, but also shed some light on what exactly developer advocacy is. Hi, Yujian. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you doing, Sonam?
Pretty good, thank you. I'm so glad you could join me here today. And should we get started? I have some fun questions ready for you.
Yeah, let's get into it.
Awesome. So let's talk about the open source tools and the whole stack. So first thing first, what are open source models?
Yeah, so this is a great question because there's actually not a whole lot of agreement on what actually open source models in the industry are. Typically, when people say open source models, what they mean is open weight,
Mhm.
which means that you can take the models and you can run them yourselves. Then there are, the people who are kind of pushing for, hey, like we don't just need open weight models, but we also want like open data. Like show us the data set that you're training these models on, and then anything in between, right? Like anything in the hyperparameters that you can tune and adjust, and all these different things. Personally, I think that um, the data, it's going to be hard to get companies to open source their data. But I think the open weight models are a great place to start, and then you can always fine tune them if you need, or you can always do rag or whatever to get what you need out of them.
Fair. And do you think that what are people or companies losing out on having the having closed source models?
Yeah, I think that like this is more of a business decision for people, really. Proprietary models are give you this kind of moat, so to speak, because people don't know what your model is, and so you have a specialized model. But also like people who are building who are building the closed source models, like you don't have, I think at least, you don't have as much trust from the community. People were really unhappy with OpenAI not having open source models anymore. So that kind of thing is I guess what they're losing out on is really the community trust, the people supporting it. And I think I mean your audience probably doesn't know, but that I'm a big proponent of open source, and I run a community called Open Source Software for AI, and I think that it's very, very important that we have this kind of grassroots, ground up movement for
Hmm.
AI tooling.
Fair, fair. Yeah, open source, I think it's really good for the community, as you said. So, how do you think the development of these various AI technologies benefit from open source models and other tools? We got like the community point, and like community trust, as you said. So, what else do you think are the benefits?
Yeah, yeah. The other benefits are really that, when you have something that's open source, you are able to kind of draw, like, once again, on the community to help patch things or to
Hmm.
help drive, like, what is it that people really need? And not only this, but there's also it's important that, uh, especially with the power of AI, that we have something that is, not biased,
Hmm.
that is ethical, that is responsible. So we kind of, this is really, really all of it kind of goes back to the public and the community. To me, is we need to be able to have input and drive these kinds of outcomes for these models to make sure that we're not doing anything that's like sketchy or too biased or things like that, right?
Right, right. Makes sense. Yeah, so as I mentioned in the beginning, like there are so many tools, and I'm sure you came across most of them as well. So let's briefly discuss about what an LLM application stack looks like. So like, what are the different components that go into um, an LLM app development?
Yeah, this is also a great question for me because I have that article on the LLM app stack, and actually I'm about to do the April update, and so I have a couple of new sectors that I didn't have in March, and I
Mm,
don't really know if this is actually appropriate to all put it into the LLM app stack, but what I have here is kind of like LLMs. Of course, LLMs are part of the LLM app stack, and then as an alternative to LLMs, you have the LLM providers, right? They are the companies that um, they don't necessarily create their own LLMs, but they provide you ways to access them. And then you have orchestration. And so orchestration is the set of tools that allow you to put these LLMs together, or
mhm.
these LLM app components together. And so you would think about this, LangChain, Llama Index, Haystack, those kind of tools.
Yep.
And then there's the data processing tools. And so data processing is a huge space. And I'm actually not fully convinced that it's fair to just call them the data processing tools. Some of these data processing tools are for processing data, like putting them into your vector database or for putting them into your data set for fine tuning. And some of them are for, like ensuring that you have data quality, like voxel or stuff like that.
Mhm.
Um, and then there's the vector databases, of course, right? So, Zillus, Milvus, that's what I work on right now. Very important piece for RAG, essentially the cornerstone of RAG. And then there's the embedding models. I think this is like a piece that a lot of people don't really think about as much right now, but it's actually incredibly important. And the embedding models are the way that you turn your unstructured data into numbers, and so
Mhm.
that your vector database can work with them. And then there's of course the LLM tuning stuff, right? So there's fine tuning for LLMs. That's something that's kind of coming up recently, or coming
Mhm.
up more, uh, to becoming more important. I
Yeah.
think at the beginning people didn't really understand how to use this, and now it's becoming something that people are beginning to understand a bit better.
Mhm.
And then there's the quality tuning. And when I say quality tuning, I mean like tuning the quality of your entire application. So this is where you look at monitoring and eval and things like that. And then there's infrastructure. So these are like the tools that kind of help you, let's say, deploy these applications. So an example, might be like Titan ML or Bento ML or NIM from NVIDIA, right?
Mm.
And then the last one that I just added is security. So this was something that I hadn't really thought of initially, and I don't know if this really like is. I mean, it is obviously a critical piece of putting LLM apps into production. But I'm not entirely sure if this belongs in the app stack or the ops stack, because it's really important for the way that you operationalize things. But if you're just building these applications for fun, or if you're just building an application so that you can use it, you probably don't care too much about that.
Mm. Okay. Yeah, that's yeah, the security point, I guess, as much as it is important, I don't know how many people are actually focusing on that part of the whole development cycle. So you mentioned a lot of different tools and components. So what is your go-to or favorite combination of tools for building any LLM application?
Yeah. So my go-to LLM provider is Octo AI. Um,
Okay.
So obviously you got GPT, you got OpenAI, right? You can go use that. You can go directly to Mistral. You can go directly to Upstage for Solar.
Mm-hmm.
You can go directly to Amazon Bedrock, Google Gemini, all these places. I really like Octo AI. I've worked with them for a while. I've also checked out their interface, and their interface is pretty similar to OpenAI. And what I like about them is that I have access not just to the LLMs, but also to video and image generation tools. So it's really nice to just have all of this in one
Nice.
platform in one place that makes it easy to use. So if I want to do like some multimodal work or things like that, it's really nice to be able to use both of these in the same provider.
Mm-hmm.
The orchestration tools, like I said, LangChain, Llama Index, Haystack are all very popular. For RAG, I particularly like Llama Index. Um, but when it comes to more like, let's say I want to build something that is more, that is not just RAG, but maybe I want to chain some LLMs together. That's where I think LangChain really shines, is the ability to kind of like put these outputs multi-step kind of things. Not that Llama Index can't do that, but I think that's what LangChain really shines. And then Haystack is something that I would go for if I wanted to do something that was more of, um, let's say, enterprise ready. And so there's more kind of like these enterprise features like RBAC and stuff like that. That I don't know if Llama Index or LangChain has them. They might. They don't advertise them anyway. But Haystack has this kind of like nice set of more uh, production level tools. So that's what I would go for if I were to build something in production. And then I also want to mention something that I think is really interesting here. So there's this tool called Boundary ML, and they do something really interesting. So what they do is they have a kind of almost like a GUI-like feature for putting together different pieces of the LLM and for allowing you to, I mean, it's not really no code, but it's almost like a low code way to orchestrate different pieces of the stack of the stack for LLMs. And I think one thing I was playing around with their tool, and I think one thing they do really really well, and this absolutely blew my mind when I heard about this, was they do code generation for they compile into Python and TypeScript. And the first thing I talked to the founder about was like I was like, dude, why are you doing code generation? Like it's non-deterministic. And he's like, no, we wrote our own compiler. And I was like, oh my God, okay. So
Yeah.
like,
Okay.
yeah, I know. I was like, oh, okay, that's wild. And they have really good strict guidelines for enforcing like JSON type content and extracting out the right thing. So they abstract a lot of the things that you would have to do with LangChain or Llama Index, and they make that real nice. So I like them as well. Um, for data processing, my go-to data quality tool is Voxel. I think
Mhm.
like they just, I mean, it's easy, it's powerful, um, and it's got a nice GUI, and it's got a nice developer experience. I don't really have much more to say about it. It's good. um,
Nice, nice.
and then in terms of piping data or streaming data, there's a lot of different ways you can do this. I actually just do this raw, like by hand. Just you can just do this in Milvus. But if you want something that does it more automatically for you, you probably look at something like, like Kafka or
Mm.
Spark. I think
Okay.
Spark is pretty popular.
Gotcha.
Um, and then for vector databases,
I mean,
of
I
course,
don't even want to ask. Let's move on.
of course, I'm going to use Milvus. This is the best
Uh-huh.
for this.
I wouldn't
Um,
have guessed it. Mm-mm.
yeah, I mean, although I will give you my honest opinion is that I do actually think that out of the current databases on the market, Milvus is the most advanced in terms of like the features that are available. Um,
Could
and
you be
then
more subtle?
yeah, well, hey, I there's a reason why I work at Zillis and not Pinecone,
I
right?
agree, agree. Okay.
Um, and then the embeddings models, of course, Hugging Face. Everybody knows
Mm.
Hugging Face. Hugging Face
Yeah.
does a great job on this. There's nothing else to really say. They have all the embeddings models you could ever need. Uh, the only thing I could think of as even like you know, anywhere close to Hugging Face is PyTorch. So PyTorch has their Torch Hub. That's not their focus, right? PyTorch is really focused on helping you
Yeah.
build models, but Torch Hub does provide some good embeddings models, especially for images. They have many versions of ResNet on there.
Okay.
Um, and then the quality tuning stuff. There's honestly there's so many niches here, and it's kind of hard to say like which one do I really like more, and they are kind of different. So like for example, you can use Giscard for like red teaming, right? So
Okay.
if you want to try to like find ways to break your app, you would use like Giscard, and then there's like Brain Trust Data and Arise and Y Labs and Truera, and they all do some sort of different type of uh, what is it called? Observability or monitoring, and it just depends on what you need. And so with this, I don't have any real like suggestions on this. It's very use case dependent.
Makes
Um,
sense. Yeah.
yeah, for infrastructure tools, to be honest, I just Dockerize everything. I don't really use any of these tools. I'm sure they're lovely for production. I just don't have any usage of them, so I can't really comment on that.
I
And then
think,
I
yeah,
have no,
Docker is pretty standard. Yeah.
yeah, like I don't know. It's just I just Dockerize things, put it on a container. And
Yeah.
I haven't tried out any security tools, so I can't say.
Okay. Got it. That was very good information and good collection of tools, I must say. And this is where I take the segue, or I would say pivot, not segue, into talking about developer advocacy. And why
Yeah.
I want to talk to you about it because I myself moved or pivoted from being just a core data scientist to getting into developer advocacy. And when I talk to people about, oh yeah, I want to become like, find a job as a developer advocate or want to work as one. And they're like, what is developer advocate? And then when I first started figuring this out, I had so many different definitions on the internet, like some would call developer relations or developer advocate or tech evangelist and so on and so forth. So that's why I want to ask you, what is developer advocacy according to you, or even like what are the general industry standards around this role?
Yeah, and that's a great question because it's kind of different at every company, and that's kind of just that's that's the nature of the role.
Yeah.
The goal of the DevRel role is really to, at least in my opinion, the goal of the DevRel role is really, a, you want to make people use your products.
Right.
You want to make people understand why they should use your product. You don't just want to like blindly push your product at people. You want to make them understand like, okay, here is like the use case for this. So for example, like when I talk about Milvis, like, the use case for Milvis is like scale, or if you want to continuously update your data, right? There's a few different use cases, but it's not the best for everything. So I will actually give you an example where you wouldn't use Milvis, right? So let's say, for example, you're like, hey, I only want to have like, I only care about like 1,000 data points at a time. Like, go use something else. Like Milvis is
Hmm.
not, it's not for you, right? But there are like, there are other use cases where I would say, go use it. And then the other thing is like, one thing that I think is an important piece of DevRel is to kind of close the loop between product and marketing. So DevRel people are typically out in the community a lot. Like I think I'll probably touch more about like the personality types that fit DevRel as a role more than the role itself, because the role itself can really be quite flexible. But one core personality trait for DevRel is you have to have the ability to deal with people.
Hmm.
And you have to like people as to a somewhat of a degree. One of the most, I think, one of the most important pieces of DevRel is that you have to be in the community, and whether that means that you're going to community events or you're on like the forums and answering questions, like these are both different ways to be in the community, but you need to be in the community somehow. And so, because that's such an important piece of the role, you have this, let's say, on the ground kind of idea of things, and the product team and the engineering team, like, I mean, they're not doing this usually. I mean, sometimes they are at these events, but usually that's not their job, and that's not what they want to do, and so that's why they're not there. But you can't just have the engineering team and the product team be blindly building things, which, if you are at an engineering heavy company, is a common theme to see. So, DevRel kind of plays this role of closing the gap between what do developers want, what is going on with developers, and what should the engineering team be building, what should the product team be building. Of course, that means that DevRel also kind of plays this role into marketing and sales. Like, you know, you are essentially like a representative of the company, right? Like people, in many cases, people know like DevRel people, and they don't even know like, they don't know the company that well, but they know that, oh, like this is like this person is at events or giving talks or whatever all the time. And so you're kind of representing like, what's going on with your company. So you're kind of playing this marketing and sales role as well. So I would say DevRel sits at this intersection of marketing, sales, product, and engineering, which is a really confusing section to sit at. And like I said, it's going to depend. Every company is going to kind of depend, but I would say like core responsibilities for DevRel really, closing that loop, being in the community, and then content creation, right? Content creation is an incredibly important piece of DevRel. Um, oops, sorry, I'm burping. You have to like creating content, and you have to like education. And that's like, I think these are probably like the core pieces of DevRel that are really important. And then I will also kind of give kind of like what I look for when I look to hire for DevRel is I look at like, okay, like, this person doesn't necessarily have to have DevRel experience. But what I do look for is things like, you know, has this person produced content? Is it
Hmm.
YouTube videos? Is it blogs? Is it, I guess those are the main pieces of content. Is it podcasts, right? Like, there's a bunch of different things that you can look for in DevRel. And then the other thing is like, if they're producing content, how often are they producing content? If they're in a current DevRel role, you kind of expect them to be producing content on about a weekly basis. If they're not in a DevRel role, then maybe if they're doing it on a monthly basis, if they're doing it a couple times a month, that's really good, right? Because they've got a
Yeah.
full-time job and it's not their job to produce content. They're doing it for fun. And in fact, I would say like those people um, might even be better candidates for your like entry DevRel roles.
Hmm.
Um, and then I think the other thing I look for is like, do they have a social media presence? You don't
Right.
have to have a social media presence for DevRel, but it is like something that shows that you're interested in this kind of
Mm.
stuff. And so that's kind of like what I think about when I think about hiring for DevRel.
Makes sense. Yeah, that fits the bill. So, what's the most fun part of your job? I know you worked as a software engineer in the past, and then you turned into a developer advocate. So, what do you find it be the most fun part?
Yeah, so I was a software engineer at IBM and Amazon, and I would say that the most boring part about being a software engineer is that you spend about 8 to 10 hours a day talking to your computer. And really, I guess most of that time is, I mean, some of that time is spent in build, and some of that time is spent hitting your head against the wall. But in DevRel, what I really like to do is I like to be able to interact with the community.
Mm-hmm.
I love like talking to people, and I love hearing about like what people are doing, um, and like just seeing like, oh, what's going on. And then I think for me recently, what I've found to be incredibly rewarding and incredibly cool is like I was at an event, and someone asked one of the speakers at the event. I was a speaker at this event, but they didn't ask me this question. They were like, "What are some resources you would suggest for AI?" And the speaker was like, "Oh, you should really go talk to Yujian."
Mm-hmm.
And so I was like, oh, this is awesome. That's cool that I'm being recognized by other speakers for this. Um, and then the really cool part was that someone else in the audience actually spoke up and was like, hey, like, yeah, you guys, like, you got to go to this guy's hackathons. You got to go to this guy's events because he helped me build my first RAG app. He helped me build my first like AI app, and that was like like nobody else had helped me do that in like the 3, 4, 5 months that I'd spent trying to learn this stuff. And so that was also incredibly rewarding for me. And that's probably the coolest part of my job is just like seeing that I'm really being able to make an impact.
That's awesome. That's really good. So, you talked about what you look for in developer advocate when you're hiring, and so like, w- what do you think? What companies need developer relations or developer advocates? What kind
Yeah,
of companies?
I would say like the companies that need DevRel are primarily dev tools.
Mm-hmm.
Um, And if you're not a dev tool, you're probably like better off hiring a product manager. Sorry, yeah, product marketing manager.
Marketing manager.
And
Hmm.
so yeah, primarily dev tools and probably primarily open source. I think like you can do DevRel for closed source tools.
Hmm.
Um, and obviously James Briggs at Pinecone does a really good job of this. But it doesn't really make as much sense if you think about like the developer community. Yes, there is this portion of the developer community that likes APIs. They don't like to handle the overhead of open source tools and having to do things locally. But I think the majority of the developer community has this kind of ethos of like wanting to build things, and not only wanting to build things but wanting to understand the tools they're building with. And so that's why I think like open source is a particularly good use case for DevRel. And then yes, of course, dev tools, right?
Yeah, it just gives more boost, I think, for work as a developer advocate as well. Cool. Making the pivot again, and just like, talking about industry trends is something I really enjoy because everyone has different opinions and perspectives on this particular thing. So I'm curious to know yours. Do you think the rise of Chat GPT since, last 1 or 2 years, whatever, was it disruptive in a good way or bad?
It's great.
Nice. That was
Yes,
simple and sweet.
yes, it's great.
Awesome. I think yeah, that's enough said, I feel like. No, I think I'm with you on that. So many more opportunities and like so many different use cases that people didn't even anticipate or imagine. So great, cool. Uh, okay, and last question for you. I know that you are very involved in community, whether it's in the Bay Area or Seattle or in general, and you have worked with or spoken with many different startup founders and people working in startups. So, what are some of the things that usually help any startup thrive?
Yeah, that is a really good question. So I will tell you, number one is getting sales, getting revenue, right? You have to have money to run a company. That's very
Yeah.
important. So that's number one. Number two is I think having a strong team
Hmm.
that is aligned. Um, and so I think one of the things that is really interesting to me when I was originally doing my first set of like DevRel work. So I actually didn't get an official DevRel job until I had written over 200 pieces of content. But when I was first kind of doing this work, I got some contract work, and I didn't want to join any company at the time. I wanted to try to do things on my own for a bit, and I found that a lot of companies really want to hire and they really want like headcount. But then if you ask them like, you know, what is the goal of hiring for this role, or things like that, they don't really know. And that's kind of like, as a team as a startup, as a company that is hiring, as the hiring manager, as the person that is hiring, you got to know like what is it that I want out of making this hire, right? Because hires are big commitments. As a company, you're spending in this space in DevRel at least, you're spending at least $100,000 a year, plus benefits and whatever for this person, and they're also coming and they're going to commit spending 40 hours in startups, probably more like 50 to 60 hours a week, like working on getting your company to be successful. And one of the things that I think is really good is just have that alignment. Make sure that they know like, hey, like here's like what we want from this role, not necessarily what you want from that person, but from that
Hmm.
role. Because sometimes what happens is you hire someone in and they do the role for a while and then they realize that, hey, maybe I want to do something else, and then you really like them, so you get them into another role, and so on and so on. But um, you know when it comes to that, like you have to know, as the hiring team, you have to know what it is that you're hiring for and how it fits into your strategic goals. So I think
Right.
one of the most interesting questions to ask as an interviewee is, how does this role, or how can I most quickly align to the strategic goals of this company? And that's
Got it.
kind of how you can tell, like, have they thought about this role, or are they just hiring for this role because everybody else is hiring for this role?
Everybody else. Got it. That's a good question. Very good question. And it reflects a lot about how the company thinks or like, how they want to structure their culture as well. Cool. Well, thank you so much, Yujian. This was an enlightening conversation with so many different tools and ideas. Thanks for sharing with me and my audience as well.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks for having me on, Sonam.
Absolutely.